Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and so far in this series we've talked a lot about recent world history and how it all teaches us important lessons to carry forward into our understanding of Ukraine and Russia right now. So now that we have time to talk more about global context before getting into a discussion of how the war is going on the ground, that means it's time to really address the elephant in the room: NATO in the post-Cold War era. On one hand, there was absolutely a chance since the end of the Cold War, and an opportunity as well to say, everybody listen, countries are massively impoverished and starving right now, and we're going to step in and be the bigger people here. And we could have stepped in and done everything that we could do to economically help the former Soviet states recover and build them into functioning states. We never did that, though. We never offered them aid until they were being invaded. We just let oligarchs take control of all of that power, to re-solidify it under fundamentally corrupt structures and monopolies. We thought that this would be better because it was capitalist now. And the damage that that allowed them to do. And not only that, but the ability to get away with it. That damage had in part been done by our inaction. We never allowed them, even the civilians, to shift in our minds from enemies to innocents, or even the victims of a part that we had played in a larger war. And this was doubly true of Russia and Russian citizens. It's like our empire needs a heel, a growing threat. And Russia was our easy enemy. It's not even hard to make us wary of Russia. Look at how many of us ate up Russiagate and really believed that Russia had interfered with our election in some meaningful way, other than driving divisive propaganda online on social media. I'm not saying that Russian propaganda on social media isn't a pretty big problem with a certain group of people who are definitely overly online, and especially those who already believe certain conspiracy theories, because then it's easier to kind of inject some of that flavor into your propaganda and get them to believe it because they already believe one of the things that you're saying. And unfortunately, this seems to be more and more apparent now when you look at what people really believe about the Russia-Ukraine crisis on the ground at places like the People's Convoy, which has been a right-wing copycat movement of the Freedom Convoy, which I discussed in an earlier video. I mean, maybe we just need this kind of bad guy to justify ballooning our military budgets, and we've certainly done that here. And this is in addition to doubling our aid to give Ukraine in a single year more than we gave the Mujahideen in the entirety of Afghanistan. Again, not saying that was a great decision when we did it then, just pointing out that we're giving like a decade's worth of military aid all at once. And that even though we're doing this, and even though we have committed from the beginning not to put boots on the ground or actually use our military, for some reason our military budget is also ballooning at the same time. So the idea of taking the former Soviet states into the fold and reducing the us versus them mentality that's been used as the core of our cultural differences for the last 70 years and used during that time to again and again militarize against an overseas threat. It just never seems to have occurred to the people in power that this was a feasible option. After many years of sanctions that pushed their economy to the breaking point, we do kind of owe them in a very similar way that we owe Afghanistan, though perhaps not quite as literally. There's a point in the 1990s where NATO could have been phased out, or at least the military aspect of NATO, as it was no longer necessary, in that the Cold War was over. The only reason to maintain the NATO military alliances is if you want to maintain the Cold War. And I can see some argument for that. As you know, Soviet Russia may not be a part of the Soviet Union anymore. They may have economically collapsed, sure. But Russia, at the same time, didn't sell its nukes and didn't get rid of them either. The logic here being that it's still a nuclear powerhouse. Therefore, we should keep NATO as a safeguard against their nuclear power so long as they remain one. But I think that's just a perspective that makes enemies. There are other nuclear-armed countries out there that we don't have a NATO alliance against to keep them in check, right? So why is it that Russia is the one country that we still, to this day, do not trust with nuclear weapons? And there was a point when Russia asked to join NATO. We could have accepted them, along with all the other former Soviet states. It's a lot harder to declare war on someone when you're under some of the same military and economic frameworks, because the risk of tearing those frameworks apart could be damaging enough to encourage you not to declare war on one of your fellow members. And could Russia object to the former Soviet states, such as Ukraine, Georgia, Finland, all of these states? Could Russia really object to them joining NATO? Would they have the same argument about NATO getting right up against their borders if they were a NATO country themselves? Wouldn't that diffuse these rhetorical bombs? Before this, I said that the Russian state justification is paper thin, and the NATO argument is a bit of it, so let me debunk that. NATO has an open policy that they will not allow a state to join NATO if they do not control the entirety of the lands within their borders. So, from the beginning of this, separatists, Russian-backed separatists, the invasion of Donbass, even the invasion of Crimea, which remains contested internationally, Ukraine has not been eligible to join NATO. Whether or not they wanted to join, whether or not other countries might have wanted them in, or whether or not someone was willing to send them an invitation, ultimately the results will always be the same. It just wasn't going to happen unless Putin and the separatists were both willing to relent, and maybe even have to give back Crimea. This, like the myriad of excuses Putin made for himself, is a falsehood, really only designed to make sense to people who exclusively follow Russian state propaganda. Nazis run Ukraine? No. NATO will let Ukraine join? No. The people have voted for independence. Nope, not even that. The only true part is this. Ukraine was given its independence from today's Russia all the way back in the 19-teens. So unless Putin has a time machine, there's not much he can do about that one either. And as for his prospects of taking them back by force, I'm not convinced. During the Cold War, there was a concept known as the Doomsday Clock. The Doomsday Clock is a symbol that represents the likelihood of a man-made global catastrophe. Maintained since 1947 by the members of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the clock is a metaphor for threats to humanity from unchecked scientific and technical advances. The clock represents the hypothetical global catastrophe as midnight, and the Bulletin's opinion on how close the world is to a global catastrophe as a number of minutes or seconds to midnight, assessed in January of each year. The main factors influencing the clock are nuclear risk and climate change. The Bulletin Science and Security Board monitors new developments in the life sciences and technology that could inflict irrevocable harm to humanity. Midnight has a deeper meaning to it besides the constant threat of war. There are various things that are taken into consideration when scientists from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists decide what midnight and global catastrophe really mean in a particular year. They might include politics, energy, weapons, diplomacy, and climate science as potential sources of threats, including nuclear threats, climate change, bioterrorism, and even artificial intelligence. The clock's original setting in 1947 was 7 minutes to midnight. It has been set backward and forward 24 times since, the farthest being 17 minutes from midnight in 1991, and the nearest being 100 seconds. That's 1 minute and 40 seconds from midnight, and that has been from 2020 to the present. The clock was moved 2.5 minutes in 2017, then forward to 2 minutes to midnight January of 2018, left unchanged in 2019. Then, in January of 2020, it was moved forward to 100 seconds before midnight. The clock setting has been left unchanged both in 2021 and 2022. Since 2010, the clock has been moved forward over 4 minutes, and has changed by 5 minutes and 20 seconds, even looking at its original setting in 1947. Due to multiple factors other than just nuclear annihilation, it's thought to represent in the public consciousness. This steady advance towards midnight could easily have as much or more to do with it the threat of global climate change than nuclear war. But it's interesting to note that in 1991, the year the final Soviet state, Ukraine, declared its independence, that's as close to safety as the world has ever been. Perhaps they too saw the means through which we might come to the end of an age of nuclear fears in that moment. And perhaps we have betrayed their hopes for the future in that moment as well, by maintaining a cold hostility towards Russia and a bitter indifference to the former Soviet states. I suppose only time will tell if we can ever make it back to 17 minutes to midnight again. Here's hoping. It would seem like a lot of people took this position before the conflict started, that there was absolutely no way Ukraine would be able to defend themselves against Russia. Most people have a mental framework of Russia being this massive country in the same way that China is, and that Ukraine is just some small stepping stone between Russia and the West. Ukraine is about the size of France, and many parts of it are much more densely populated than your average Russian city. Yes, Russia is a large country, don't get me wrong, even in terms of manpower. Even if we're not talking about equipment, the military advantage that Russia has is quite immense. However, the invasion is a lot more demanding than you might expect, and Ukraine was expected to be able to conscript a lot of citizens in the event of an invasion. In this respect, I think their success has exceeded many outside expectations as well. It's still by no means a fair or easy fight, but at the same time, this was never something that was a foregone conclusion that Ukraine could succeed here, especially with the amount of outside aid they were getting even before the February invasion happened. One of the many interesting ways that this is playing out that we haven't really seen so much in a war scenario before is this meme war that's going on across the internet, right? I really enjoyed the perspective of looking at this as a meme war, at least, because there's a lot of Russian propaganda, and it's 2022, and Ukraine is fighting the most propagandistic culture in the world, right up there with the US and China. Propaganda warfare is going to be one of the battlefields on which this war is fought, and the counter-propaganda here was really easy to make. You don't even have to write Ukrainian propaganda right now. You just have to show what's actually happening in the streets. Because actually seeing what's happening has an incredible effect on the Russians and the Ukrainian people as well. It's like almost no matter what comes out of Ukraine, it's working to the Ukrainian advantage. The sad footage that you get out of this reinforces and breaks down the Russian narrative that they're not targeting civilians, when it's obvious that they are. I find it really interesting to know that. And I'm curious about how effective this will be as a counter to a lot of the Russian propaganda counter-narratives to the Russian citizens. When they're saying a lot of things right now like, well, we're only bombing schools because, radical elements, they're using the schools to hide, right? And they're using these children as human shields. We had to bomb that school. It wasn't because we wanted to attack civilians. It wasn't because we were committing a terrorist act within this war, purely for political intimidation. It wasn't because we were committing war crimes against our brothers, no. But the reason that I don't think that this type of propaganda is necessarily going to fly within Russia is because this is a carbon copy of the US imperialist propaganda. It's a carbon copy of Israeli imperialist propaganda. This is exactly the type of narrative that the Russian state media is happy to call out. Maybe not so much in the case of Israel, but definitely in the case of the United States. So it's very likely that the Russian audience may already know that these talking points are lies, because they've already been told by their government, and they already have seen them in the context of Americans saying it over the last few years. And maybe they don't remember this? I don't know. Again, I'm really curious how effective this particular line of counter-propaganda will be, because if there's any people in the world that have been primed to recognize these talking points as absolute bullshit, it's got to be the Russian people. And I think this explains the massive protests that we're seeing, even growing within the Russian borders. You get a lot of sad footage that really encourages soldiers to question why they're in this war, that encourages Russian civilians to question Russian propaganda. But then there's also another category of true Ukrainian propaganda that is just, like, I've seen so many wild fucking videos. Like, did you see this $16 million tank getting towed by a Ukrainian farmer in his tractor? That was hilarious. I mean, you have these scenes like Tiananmen Square, where you see a column of Russian tanks coming through a Ukrainian city, being stopped by thousands of protesters. And they're filming this because they know it's only going to go one of two ways. The story will either be that Russians are being completely shut down by this, or they aggress against these peaceful protesters defending their homeland. It's either going to be a sad story or a triumphant one. And neither makes Russian imperialism look particularly good or even competent. A lot of these soldiers, especially the first wave of soldiers, came in under this impression that they were coming to free the sovereign Russian citizens of the Donbass from an alleged Nazi occupation. Those were the marching orders when they first left and started their campaign for the actual invasion of Ukraine. These people are in the field every day, and these Russian soldiers are realizing that the reasons they were told they had to do this were absolute bullshit. One of the logistical issues is that there's a lot of Russian soldiers who haven't had cell phone service since they entered Ukraine. They don't have access to social media. They don't really have any way of gauging how this is going by use of the internet. So just imagine the surprise when a soldier, walking for hours from a truck out of gas or stuck in the mud, is met with a hostile Ukrainian greeting as he's forced to grovel for them for food and fuel. We've seen this as well in videos that have been majorly embarrassing to this big, tough Russian military. And this whole thing makes me wonder if Vladimir Putin said the Russian equivalent of "you will be greeted as liberators" to the soldiers who first entered Ukraine. Because as you hear about Russian soldiers early on going door to door in Ukrainian villages looking for fuel and food, and finding only resistance, they're really acting as though they expect the Ukrainians to be grateful for their actions. And it's almost as if some of these people aren't fully aware that they are the invaders or aggressors in this situation because of how they've been propagandized prior to entering the country. In Ukraine right now, men are not being allowed to leave the country if they are of military age. They're being encouraged to arm themselves and defend their country, defend their cities. And a lot of people have done this. However, I don't necessarily feel good about them not letting some of their citizens out of their country when Russian forces have already been so willing to inflict civilian casualties. At the same time, the Russian army is mostly conscripts too, and we do still have some form of a draft here in the United States, even if we don't use it. So I can't be too mad at Ukraine for doing this, especially since this is probably the most logical and ethical time to do something like that. But at the same time, for the rest of the world, it's far easier to get them weapons and training than bodies on the ground. So the human capital of potential soldiers in Ukraine is incredibly important right now. So yes, it's not the greatest move, but I have been able to confirm that this is happening, and it is critically strategically important here. Now, Ukrainians are arming themselves and taking positions to defend their cities. They may be outnumbered overall, or before the invasion started, their trained military may have been outnumbered. But as long as there are enough bodies to carry them, it seems like every Western country is happy to send them a whole lot of arms. There's a big difference between arming civilians and actually having trained military, and Ukraine will always be outnumbered in this respect. But they might be able to give a similar number of boots on the ground ultimately, especially when you consider how slow and arduous the process has been for Russians to get their equipment inside of Ukrainian borders. It also means that at least in the near term, it's far more likely that Ukrainians will continue to outnumber Russians in most scenarios. That being said, even just saying this, Chernobyl and Kherson have both fallen to Russia already, just over a week into the conflict. Side note about Chernobyl, yes, the radiation levels have increased by a bit, but it's still a long ways lower than anything that anyone really needs to be concerned about. Unless you happen to be a soldier directly occupying that area, but even then it's not a huge concern. But at the same time, if it's a concern to anyone, it will be the people who are directly occupying that area who will be most affected by this. And just like many other elements of this story, one wrong shelling would rapidly change that scenario. But for now, there's not really a huge risk of radiation out of Chernobyl as things stand. Still, this is a fight 8 years in the making. Russia has been threatening these people for over a decade, even poisoning Russia's political competition in Ukraine in 2004. Many Ukrainians feel like Russia is long overdue some comeuppance, and they've been standing at the ready to give it to them. Russia made a mistake in not remembering the passion of the Orange Revolution or the Euromaidan, where protesters fought back against police who had been given orders to kill them by the Russian leadership. The time has come for them finally to stand up, like they did in 1991. And history finds that they are ready and waiting. But I do want to point out that there is some Ukrainian propaganda that is not as truthful as the things I mentioned earlier, like the Ghost of Kyiv. I'm not necessarily mad at that one because it seems more like a meme than an actual honest attempt at fake news. It's fake news that's become a meme. And I'm not particularly mad at it. Snake Island, the recording of them telling the Russian ship to fuck off. That was true enough. But within days we found out that these people didn't actually die, and that actually there were far more of them than was originally reported. But that's all relatively quaint compared to what was said at the Munich Security Council. And that we should unpack. Standing before the Munich Security Council in Germany, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, days before the invasion of his homeland, says in his speech that if Russia is allowed to take Ukraine, the border between Russia and Europe, that Europe will be next. It's a passionate speech. It's hard not to watch it and feel a sense of a call to action that Germany must have felt before signing an agreement to close the newly operational Nord Stream 2 if Russian troops step foot inside of Ukraine. The story he told was one of an imperial Russia, bent on taking back the Soviet states and powering through to become a threat to Europe. This is a good story if you need military aid. But to me, it seems utterly unrealistic, or at least anytime in the near future. There are a number of reasons for this, but chief among them is that Russia isn't prepared to get an easy victory in Ukraine by any means. Compared with the invasion of Afghanistan, in which the country's leader, Amin, was killed in only 3 days, it's been weeks at this point, and Zelenskyy is regularly posting touching and personal cell phone videos letting us know that he's alive and strong in spirit. In the long term for Russia, the invasion will be the easiest part. And spoiler alert, so far, Russians are really fucking it up, and far underperforming the Kremlin's goals for the operation. In their estimates, it seems that they expected that Kyiv would have fallen within the end of the second week. And yet, they still fight on in Mariupol, which is right across the Russian border. In part because it's the muddy season, in part because of aging military equipment and poor maintenance, but also in part because of a historical lack of infrastructure outside of the Russian capital that dates back into the Soviet era. To advance their forces across Russia, Putin relies on rail lines, and these rail lines currently end at the Ukrainian border, meaning that while it's not difficult to amass soldiers and equipment at the border, getting them into and across a contested battlefield is proving nearly impossible, made worse in part by the destruction of a few key pieces of Ukrainian infrastructure. Holding Ukraine will result in a large on-the-ground commitment of troops for the Russian military, as does Russia itself. So this alone stretches the Russian army quite thin. Even if they had the will to advance beyond Ukraine, it might take years. And even then, the infrastructure doesn't exist to move the Russian military through Ukraine in a timely manner. Russia may attempt to use the remains of their divided military at this point to, say, invade Georgia, where they already have a stronghold. But even this much expansion within the next decade would be incredibly risky for Putin. And even to say that, is to say that pro-independence insurgencies won't be common even in 10 years, and this may not be the case. Now obviously this would be a rather bleak future for Ukraine, but it's far from the rapid expansion that Zelenskyy is suggesting here either. Russia is a powerful country still, but it's weaker than the former Soviet Union. And even the Soviet Union realized that actions such as those that Zelenskyy is proposing here would be their own suicide. Still, even in the realistic picture, this looks bad for Ukraine, even if Russian-European wars aren't likely a part of the picture even in the future. In a recent interview, Zelenskyy responded to concerns that a no-fly zone would be dangerous escalation. His response was to ask essentially, dangerous for me? No. Dangerous for them? Maybe. But what I know for certain is that without our skies being safe, many Ukrainian civilians would die. And he's not wrong. But I think this downplays just how bad nuclear war could be for the rest of the world. And he's right. We are hiding behind that excuse, as we largely did throughout the Cold War. But it wasn't unwise to act in such a way either. And that was a war we were able to win without making it a hot war. Though, for those who died in the numerous proxy wars, it felt hot enough. It's not just to say that not acting will have its own cost, and it's far more in the realm of certainty than simply risk. My fear is that there is still so much time to escalate this, and we have already escalated faster than I would have expected. It seems like every day we talk about a new sanction we could do, but think it might be too much. By the following day we've done it, and moved on to drumming up the next unthinkable thing that we might do. It's his duty to his people to drum up our sympathy. But we don't need anybody else helping us beat our own war drums, and we certainly need no exaggerations. In this plea, he claims that not instituting a no-fly zone would result in Ukraine losing millions of lives. This, like a Russian invasion of Europe, is unlikely. Looking at the much better armed Soviet Union in their 10-year engagement with the disorganized but well-armed and well-funded tribalist resistance, they inflicted between 500,000 and 2 million casualties in Afghanistan over the course of 10 years, while suffering 2,000 losses. Around two weeks in, Ukrainian sources estimate over 6,000 Russian soldiers have already died in this conflict. A number everyone is assuming to be inflated. But even if it's inflated by 3 times, that means that Russia has already lost as many soldiers here in 2 weeks than they did in the decade they fought the Mujahideen. Compared to then, they face a modern military here, and a country full of volunteer soldiers ready to defend their homes. Civilian casualties here will be bad. It will be quite a long time, however, before they ever reach 1 million. And at the rate the Russians are losing money, equipment, and soldiers, I'm calling it now, they're never going to make it to 1 million without their entire military collapsing. Of course, it doesn't take anywhere near 1 million dead to make this a grave tragedy. However, it does matter that we calmly and clearly assess threats. Millions dead is perhaps worth risking nuclear retaliation, but is 100,000? Is 10,000? At some point we might be more willing to step in, but for right now, with the exception of nuclear retaliation and holding European fuel prices hostage, Putin doesn't seem to be much of a threat outside of the borders of Russia and Ukraine. This may change with time, but for now, despite Zelensky's rhetoric to the West, Putin isn't enough of a global threat to be worth risking an international nuclear war. At least, not yet. Of course, it's not just Ukraine that's seeking to elevate Putin's threat to the world. Conservative American Christian commentator Pat Robertson said that God is telling Putin to cut through Ukraine and cut through Europe, to declare war in Israel in order to bring about the end times, because, I guess Pat Robertson is getting closer to death, and he really wants to see the end of the times before he goes. He doesn't want to, die in vain. Look, I can't pretend to understand how this guy's brain is working, but maybe if you spend all your life believing the kind of crazy religious beliefs that Pat Robertson does, you start looking forward to the apocalypse. And I'm not picking on Christians there. This is a man who literally thinks that there are demons in clothes that you might buy from Goodwill. That kind of crazy. However, there is one form of desperately needed aid that is coming into Ukraine from across the world, and that's bodies. Inspired by Ukraine's story, or perhaps terrified of Zelensky's doomsday predictions, these potential foreign soldiers, horrified by on-the-ground reporting of the invasion that they've seen, are coming in from NATO countries and non-NATO countries alike, and most especially from former Soviet states, even including Russia's partner in this invasion, Belarus, and a not insignificant number of soldiers from Russia itself. But will this alone be enough? Like in the Cold War, for these NATO countries, the official involvement of their military in this conflict would draw basically the whole world into war. But what about other former Soviet nations, those who share a border with Russia, whom aren't a part of NATO? While I don't agree that NATO is a military threat to Europe in the near term, for a state like Georgia, I wouldn't be willing to make the same prediction. There is a real potential danger here for these states. Plus, it seems like to me that dropping a nuclear bomb on a country so close to your borders is a terrible idea. It seems like dropping a nuclear bomb on a country that you would want to invade and occupy is also a terrible idea. So I think that if there's one set of countries in the world who can actually skirt the world's fears of nuclear escalation and actually provide boots-on-the-ground military aid to Ukraine, I think it's these former Soviet states that aren't yet in NATO. As an update to this, by the way, it seems that Ukraine, Poland, and the UK have formed a trilateral agreement that will see them fighting this war on multiple fronts, although none of them are traditional military fronts because Poland and the UK are both NATO nations. This does mean that they will be coordinating on things like cyber defense. And this is kind of an interesting line to see being pushed by NATO nations, and at the time I started writing this, I didn't think that it was one that would be pushed, but at the same time, this isn't too far of an escalation from where we are at this point, from what we are already seeing from nations around the world. And it does bear saying, because I think that at some point in writing this, I will say that the news has been good in reporting this, but it has also more recently platformed a lot of people who want to escalate the conflict as well, in a lot of ways that we're talking about throughout this particular part of the video series. And it just seems to be the negative byproduct of this 24-hour news cycle, and the fact that the news wants to milk this like their new 9/11. So this goes from an issue that was completely ignored to something that has to fill the entirety of a 24-hour news cycle. And when you spend several days where there really isn't much to say about what's happening on the ground, because Russian troops have been stuck in formation in massive convoys for days, if not over a week at this point, then you have to start pushing at the fringes of what's the next boldest step we can take. And as you take those steps, as you push for those steps, within a week of this, all of a sudden, you're platforming people who want to take out heads of state and want to disguise fighter jets to shoot down Russian jets in the sky over Kyiv. When I started writing this, we were all still at a point of escalation, where we were talking about like sanctions that we've already done, like SWIFT, how that seemed way too extreme. And then they started platforming people who thought that SWIFT was the next thing they needed to do. And that pretty much covered all the sanctions that we were unwilling to do on day one that have already been put into effect now. And from that point on, it's gotten rapidly more militaristic since we seem to be out of sanctions. And it only seems to be getting worse by the day. You can hear the drumbeat building in this really uncomfortable way, because you don't manufacture consent overnight. But on the topic of non-NATO solidarity, we've already seen key officials from Belarus stepping down from their positions, and many in the Belarusian military being absolutely unwilling to cooperate with Russian invasion efforts. And maybe there's a bit of political calculus here going on with Russia that since there's already Russian soldiers within their borders, they don't want to spread themselves too thin. But they're also another country in this, just as I mentioned before, that has an interest in Russia not advancing past Ukraine. I don't necessarily think that like, even if Russia were to send their troops into Ukraine to support the Ukrainian effort, I still don't think that Russia would invade Georgia in retaliation. I think that building this former Soviet solidarity would be pretty powerful, because if all of these states came together in their own sort of union, like an independent NATO, if they all grouped together in a way to say, well, if you attack any one of us, you attack all of us, that could work in holding back a country like modern-day Russia. Ukraine could take non-NATO states and create this sort of NATO analog. But this is a terrible time to do it, unfortunately. A lot of these states might also be seeing the writing on the wall and thinking, okay, if they succeed in Ukraine, I mean, it might not be a while before they invade my country. Now, I'm not saying that I don't think that ultimately Putin is thinking about taking more than one of these states back long term. But I don't think that logistically he can handle a second invasion while he's still engaging with Ukraine. His military already is having enough problems there, so imagine what would happen long term if they kept fighting this way without a massive bolster of impending reinforcements, which has always been the Russian government's ace in the hole in this situation. But at the same time, do I begrudge the people in Ukraine for pushing for a no-fly zone? For pushing to join NATO and the EU even now? For pushing to get us in on the ground? Or at least sending airplanes and drones? Do I blame them for that? No. I completely understand. If America was being invaded by someone like Russia and ignoring the NATO alliance and why this scenario probably isn't realistic, I would probably say the same things to the rest of the world that Volodymyr Zelenskyy is saying now. Whether I thought they happened to be true or realistic or not. Fuck you and your thoughts and prayers, I might say. We are dying now. So I get where they're coming from. I get what they're saying. I get why they're making this kind of a maximalist case for this, even though I don't think that case is supported by evidence. But I also think it's important to say that it's not really supported by evidence, even if it is pro-Ukrainian propaganda.